issue that I'd like to talk about is related to traumatic stress. And this is my area. This is what I do a lot of my research on, and I have a center for traumatic stress research. So this is something that's very dear uh, to me, and it's something that I have a lot of passion about and exploring. So the idea of traumatic stress is related to chronic or pervasive stress that individuals and groups of individuals experience due to these external socio-political factors. And I always like to talk about trauma or traumatic stress with resilience because it speaks to a much more strength-based perspective on how individuals are able to cope even when they're experiencing major stressors. So one of the things to think about is that there are certain client populations that have experienced social and cultural marginalization over even sometimes generations. So we get generations of people who are adopting and adapting based upon this chronic stress that they're experiencing. One of the things that's important in understanding that is that social positioning of these individuals is correlative to the traumatic experiences. So it's important for us as counselors, as professional counselors, to be able to incorporate our understanding of socio-political factors in conceptualizing not only what the problem is that clients present, but also in terms of ways in which they have coped and what are their resilient factors. When we think about who are some of these client populations who might be disproportionately experiencing this marginalization, certainly we're looking at people from impoverished communities, the elderly, people who are culturally marginalized or ethnically diverse. Those who are mentally and physically impaired are often disproportionately impacted by traumatic events. So what essentially is important to understand is that when some traumatic event occurs, oftentimes it's on top of pre-existing marginalization. And so again, this idea of having a cumulative effect or cumulative trauma is important for us to pay attention to and incorporate not only in our conceptualization, but also in our service provision. So it's important for us to think about, what is culture, to understand that, and to understand the idea of multiple realities. And I'm sure many of us have already had a diversity or multicultural course where we understand that there is no one reality, or worse, that our own worldview and our own realities are not to be imposed upon our clients. Instead, we need to be curious and to learn more and to develop a relationship with our clients so that we can incorporate their worldview in the work that we do. So what is traumatic stress? I've given you an idea of PTSD. We've talked about this umbrella concept of trauma, but now let's talk about this emerging concept of traumatic stress. So it's important, again, this idea of perception, one's perception of social location, of the contextual factors of what resources do they have, looking at ecosystemic experiences such as racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, and so on, and how those experiences impact clients' ability to be resilient. And the idea that the trauma that's experienced is negative, can be very sudden within an environment, and it certainly is uncontrollable. So I mentioned earlier that some of the features of traumatic stress are that we have chronic stress that's over time. And as I said, that it could be more than months, it can be more than a few years, it can actually be over generations. And so the idea is that despite the absence of this direct exposure to some traumatic stimulus, as we see in the definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, we see traumatic responses even when there's an absence. Now, this work was developed in taking a look at the survivors of the Holocaust during World War II and the people who survived the Nazi prison camps. And we found that many of their grandchildren also had many of the trauma symptoms, even though those children never had any direct exposure. We also found that veterans from World War II, Vietnam War, and then we start looking at some of the indigenous peoples, specifically out of North America, we found similar kinds of outcomes. And these are the seminal studies that led us to understanding this issue of transgenerational trauma. Now, in the work that I've done, I've also noticed and been able to write about not only transgenerational trauma, but transgenerational resilience. So that's why I say that human beings are very resilient, and even though they can experience generations of oppression that have emotional and psychological impact, that they can still demonstrate coping skills. Some of the symptoms that we see in transgenerational trauma and traumatic stress include depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation and behavior, substance abuse, and also violence. So some of these behaviors that are presented can also impact their relationships, so their familial relationships, their work relationships, and so we can see a cluster of problems when clients come in with traumatic stress. The idea of resilience has to do with this idea of how are we able to cope in order to bounce back and get back to some equilibrium in our lives. It also helps us to understand how even members within the same family have different levels and different abilities to cope and be resilient. And so it's a very strength-based perspective. It's one that we certainly use in the discipline of counseling in order for us to take a strength-based perspective and look at client and family strengths.